I'm going to be giving a talk about modernising legacy Perl. It's a nasty job, but someone has to do it. And of course, you do get paid for doing it, which is always good. You don't get to play with the nice shiny new stuff, sadly, but we'll talk a bit more about that. So, about Talisman Technology, we do financial recruitment software, payroll, accounting, that kind of thing. And our customers have got quite large turnover, so there's quite an awful lot of financials going through our software. I've put on the slide links to our company and my LinkedIn profile. Also, the slides themselves are linked off dragonstaff.co.uk/Perl if you want to download them to review them as we go along, if I skip past slides too fast. So a bit of an introduction first about myself. So I've been using Perl since it was first released. Before then, I was stuck with Awk and Nork and DCL and all those horrible tools that we had back in the early days. Perl was released, and that was a happy day. Suddenly I could produce statistics for the computer center manager, and it was so much easier to munge them all together. So I worked across quite a different number of sectors: commercial, education, media, and international public relations. I've tangled with Koha before as well. I procured it for the British Council in the library in Lahore, Pakistan. They built a new library in 2016, so I was quite involved in running that process. Quite impressed by Koha, actually. I'm not surprised it's doing well. Back in the early 2000s, I ended up at a company called Beacon, now called Talisman Tech. We were doing early Perl CGI web programs, so it's like year 2000 on. I did about 8 years there, a couple of years part-time whilst I was doing consulting. Then I went off and did other jobs. And I came back in 2017 as a CTO because they decided, well, look, 20 years gone past, it's time to modernise the code base and make it fit for the future. So what we're going to look at today is crufty old Perl. So I've put a link there to Wikipedia to explain what cruft is. It's one of those lovely little English words, isn't it? But it's like feeling of rather nasty. It's probably got some hairs in it. It's maybe a boiled sweet or something. It's all stuck together and you don't really want to touch it. But, someone has to. So in this case, we've got Apache 1 web server with modperl 1 compiled into it. And we've been using that to run these scripts for the past 20 years. But we want to get it to Plack with later Perl and PSGI and a modern web service environment. This is going to explain how we did it, so it can be done. You don't have to despair if you're faced with something like this. So what have we got back in 2019 then? I've got a picture of Prince on the right there, his Purple Rain picture. But, it's party like it's 1999. But basically, the code was very similar to 1999 code. In fact, to show you some idea of how much modernization we've done, you can see there on the left an RS-232 plug box we ripped out of our server room last week. Finally got rid of it because you never know. VDUs might come back. You might need terminal serial lines to wire in terminals, maybe. No, we ripped it out. So this is what we had before. So Talisman Web, it was a recruitment CRM, pay and bill, and accounts. And it was a CGI protocol coming off the Apache web server. It's using the lovely frame set and frames in HTML4. Oof, remember them. At least we didn't have blinking text. So we ended up getting it onto Apache 2 front end, serving the static assets, and it was proxy through to modperl backends just to execute the CGI bin requests. That picture on the right is what it looks like. That is a frame set. That's one frame. That's another frame. There's a frame set around it. Lovely. So it was written, so it's written using Perl 5.005, it's what we started with. And then a little bit later, we got to Perl 5.008. We could suddenly do use warnings, hurrah. But we had lots of code already that had already been written with Perl 5.005, and we still had until recently MySQL 3 database. So it's a mixture of legacy Perl. Some of it is okay, and it had use warnings in. But some of it's written like C or basic, like globals, and everything's in scope, and, basic programmers not really understanding. We had some green screen 4GL code and CISM database. And by green screen, I mean, if you think about Infomix 4GL, it ran on a terminal and it's like character-based, but it was we were told it was going to replace programmers, 4GL, anybody can program. You don't need to be a geek. You don't need to be, anyone could do it. It was a complete lie, just marketing. But, we still had some of those running until recently. We finally managed to get rid of it. Our old payroll was still running in green screen. Finally managed to get rid of it just last year. We had a decent business object layer I put in. I thought, well, we can keep that and build on it. We had some badly behaved scripts some of the other programs had written who hadn't really sort of followed the Perl guidance. So these don't really tidy up after themselves. So basically you have to fork a new Perl executable every time you want to run them, because at the end, when the Perl dies, it tidies up and does the garbage collection. If you don't do it, you try to run the script repeatedly, the code dies nastily or unpredictably. But most of it was running under Mod Perl 1 for speed and on-premise servers, because back in the day I used to get in my car, I'd drive out to the customer, I'd wire up the server and put it in the machine room, and I'd wire up the VDUs and install the software. That was the way it was. But where would we like to get to? So I went and saw one of our biggest customers and sat down with their sales director and their technical director, and I said, what do you want? You're running this old, ancient software, which is critical to your business, and it's a multi-billion pounds a year turnover business. It's critical to the business. And what do you want? And so what they said was, well, we sell things like vendor-managed services where we do lots of recruitment and payment processing for other companies. But what we want is something to make it easy to sell it. So a modern design and user experience. It's got to look sexy. Salespeople go, I want to show it to people and think, I want to use it. It's going to be great. Not, here's a clunky old web screen from 2000. Also, there's green screen programs. They knew that they were sort of already a significant business risk because you're stuck using obsolete technology. Who is there left who understands how these things work? Well, a few of us in the room, I suspect, but not many people. Also, they want scalable services. It was stuck on one server underneath the IT manager's desk. Now they want to have a mixture of on-premise and in cloud, and they want to have integrations to third parties, become more and more important over the past 10 years. Also, they want things like database replication, at-rest encryption, because some of those big projects they're bidding for in the ITT, they've got to answer the questionnaire, is your data encrypted at rest, GDPR? If you can't say yes, you're off the shortlist. Pretty important. The other thing they wanted was single sign-on integration. Previously, you go into our web screen, there's a login form, type in username, password, and you're in the application, but it's only for that application or our suite of applications. But there's loads of other products they want to use for single sign-on. So what do we want to do as a company, a tech company? Well, number one, supportable. This is coming from my perspective. I don't want to make my life miserable. It's got to be supportable. I don't want some complicated Heath Robinson combination of bits and bobs and, that fell off over there and that stopped working over there and there's no problem monitoring. We can't work out how to fix it. We've already had existing high-quality production service, so it just ran and ran. It never went wrong, basically. So we wanted to try and maintain that. So not putting lots of fancy new software in and breaking the service. The customer would look at that and think, I had a working system, and now I've got a broken system. Why are you doing this to me? And modern architecture. So we did a bit of a looking around. We looked at a few different front ends, but in the end we went for React.js because it looked like that was going to be the one that was going to win. And a microservice API backend to make it a bit more flexible and split stuff out. Also the quality side of it, there weren't any unit tests in there. Weren't using Perl Critic or any of those sort of tools to look at stuff. So all of that needed to be added in. And then better documentation. We had some, but it was partial. And things like automated CI/CD, so you can do integration and deployment automatically and do testing as part of that and to pick up failures quickly. And then when you're doing a code development cycle, get very early feedback that you've made a mistake, not once you've deployed it to your customer server and the customer picks up the phone and says, why is my software broken? Dependency analysis and regression control, again, same sort of story. And also cloud computer, moving to use things like Docker, virtual machines, and a standardized development environment. What they had back then was an old Red Hat 9 server in the machine room that was shared by the developers connecting to it. So if you imagine that, you're trying to get from that to everyone having their own environment. So the first steps then, where do you start with something that's big thing to solve as this? First thing I did was I made an inventory and an archive of all of the software and product assets. And it's amazing because when you look around and you start digging and following the links through all the systems, you think, what's that? And they go, oh, that's that thing that we did for that NHS trust all those years ago. Are we still using it? Oh yes, they're still running it in Wales. Oh my God. And you look around and you find more and more of these assets and eventually you end up with a nice long inventory. You know what you've got, where it is, who's using it, what the state is, and then you do your best to find all the source code. There was sadly one product I couldn't find the source code for, but we had the compiled binary, so it was like, put that on the list of things that have to be redeveloped. Wanted to standardize what we're using. So back at the time, Red Hat, which is what we've always used, was on 7.3, and it got shipped with MySQL 5, and it got shipped with Perl 5.16.3. So I said, well, look, let's standardize on this for now. We can always come back later for a later and greater Perl, but we're not really gaining anything because we're starting from code that's written for Perl 5005, you know. So going to 5.16 is already a big jump, and you get most of the benefit because you get all the class mob stuff, so you can do all the, you know, all the nice moosey things that you want to be able to do that you can't do on older Perls. So to actually build the servers, I wrote a suite of Ansible scripts. Ansible's a tool that comes from Red Hat. It lets you automate doing system management type things for deployment. I use those to create AWS virtual machine servers. We switched starting using cloud-based servers for development. And also I did an equivalent VirtualBox local VM, which is running under Vagrant. And it replicates the setup on production. And then basically got everybody in the company to install this on, or buy them a powerful laptop and then install it on the laptop. Now everybody's got a thing that's the same as production, and they're all working on a level playing field. It took a while, but we introduced some agile processes, so that meant things like Jira ticketing. They were using some old green screen ticketing system from the 1990s, if you can imagine. Slack for communication. Why would I want to do that? I can shout across the office, well, but 2 of your colleagues are in France, and then we might want to use people in other places. Oh, yes, I suppose so. Can't they pick up the telephone? Well, not really, no, I'd like to be able to share links and stuff. GitHub. So originally they'd used SCCS, which for those who don't know, Source Code Control System, is a venerable system from the era of RCS and VCS and all those. So back in the early 2000s, we switched to using Subversion, and we sort of put checking against Subversion. And I'd set up a good practice for people using Subversion and making patch releases and deployment releases and using it. But then I went away for however many years it was, 12 years, and I came back and they got on board of using Subversion and reverted to copying files from one directory to another. That was their sort of source code management. It reverted from using Subversion, so I was a bit like, oh my God, what have you done? So we switched to using GitHub, and then I had to explain to people about what GitHub was, how you use Git, all the commands you've got to use, how you do the workflow, pull requests, all that kind of malarkey. We got there. It wasn't happening overnight, I can tell you. It was a slow process. You can imagine, staff from the 1980s. I've been working here for 25, 30 years. Why do I have to change the way that I work? It's a good question, isn't it? Why should they change? Well, when you say, well, you have to, because we have to, because that's the modern world, and if we can't do this, we're going to be bust as a business, because we need to better do these new things. But we got there in the end. I mean, it was a lot slower than I make it seem here. We got there. So this is the main application page. That's a single-page application written with React.js. It's got the React.js components. And what it does is it makes calls back to the legacy CGI scripts to chunks of HTML, and then it rewrites them on the fly, and it merges them in rather than using a frame set. It's quite tricky. We've got a supplier company who specializes in this to do this for us. And then we've also got single sign-on, and when you log into the single sign-on, you've then got a dashboard with all the different applications you can use. Some of them are ours, some of them are third parties. And from the customer's experience, it's much better and much easier for them to sell their services. So the question is how did we get there? And it's a bit like the old joke about, how do you eat an elephant? It's one bite at a time. But if you look here, what have I got here? I'm looking at my source code directory, find.-name star.cgi, word count minus L, 559 of them. How many PLs? 129 of them. So this elephant's going to take quite a while to eat. There's the naive approach. I've heard this many times from people. Do it all in one go. It will be easy. The code will be clean because it's been written from scratch. And it'll be perfect because my code will come out perfectly. It's touching, really, isn't it? The way people have this enthusiasm that their code will be perfect. They don't realize it's going to take them years to get it to be production quality. But we'll have fun. We'll write lots of code because people like writing code. That's what they enjoy. But unfortunately, the bit that's involved in making it production quality, not so much. Myself sometimes refer to this as the council of perfection. If we just use the latest framework, we do this, we do that, it'll be perfect. I've heard this many times from starry-eyed developers who are very enthusiastic. When they actually come to try and do it, this is what happens. You get a large team, burning through cash. It takes you 3 years to do it all and get it properly stable. It costs a lot of money. One variant of this is rewrite it all in Python. That'll be easy, because it'd be so much easier in Python than in Perl. And you don't realize that actually the problems you're solving are nothing to do with the language. They're more to do with the structure and the processes and all those other things. And changing the language isn't going to help you. Also, you're now in a real bad position because you're maintaining your existing customers who are running on Perl. And now you've got your new customers who are running on Python. So now you've got your Perl experts, and now I'm having to pay for Python experts. So suddenly my big brain headcount has doubled, and I'm paying for both of them. That's not too good. And then there's rewrite it in the latest framework, because it's great. I remember when all that Ruby stuff first came out, Ruby on Rails, and everyone was like, it's great, it's so great, you're going to rewrite everything in it. I was working at the BBC at the time. That was not a stable service. It used to collapse all the time, and then the guy who wrote it had to write a restart script to restart the Ruby server every 3 minutes because it was leaking memory so fast. And literally, the service that was a live service in the BBC couldn't stay up without this thing in the background killing off Ruby and restarting it. Obviously, it's a lot stable now, but that gives you a feeling of what it's like when you get those enthusiasts who want to do it and they don't realise that's what's going to happen to them. And also, I listed the frameworks. So let's see, I could put in a Catalyst. We did a bit in Catalyst back in the early 2000s. Or Majorlicious, or Dancer. Oh, hang on, no, Dancer 2. How about Raisin? Or whatever the framework of the du jour is. And you'll notice from this list that the framework will have changed by the time you get there. It's going to take you 3 years. This is a good framework today. In 3 years' time, all the goalposts will have moved. Oh no, your code's not perfect anymore because this is the latest, best standard, and your code isn't up there. It's already legacy. So your code is going to be legacy before you even get there. So you have to live with this fact and understand that that's part of the trade-off of life. Life isn't perfect, I've seen it happen many times. When I say big bang project, that usually means it's going to go bang. So how do you go about it? I would recommend a gradual approach and make it expert-led. Don't imagine, if you're a director of a company, don't imagine that you're a big brain box and you can work it all out yourself, because you can't. You'll make stupid mistakes. I guarantee you will. So what you do is you get an expert in. So I've listed a few here, like Gabo Jabo, who does the Perl Maven site, Dave Cross, Andrea Shitov, who ran Perl Yapsi EU for quite a few years, Curtis Poe, who's here, John Noviakorski. So there's loads of other people. Just ask around. But get yourself a proper expert who knows the state of play of the community and the frameworks and everything. Also, then, you see, they can come in and have a look at what you've got. They can look at it, have a think about it, advise on what the best new tech to use is, and then think out how to leverage your existing production quality code. That's really, really important, because that's money, that's working code. It's a valuable asset in your company. Don't just throw it in the bin. So what we did is I went by a recruitment company owner called Matt Geppert, runs Open Select Recruitment in London. I've hired loads of developers of him over the years, mostly not in Perl, but like Drupal and other languages. But I got this guy, he's a Perl contractor, Dave Lamley. I asked his permission to put his link up here. He helped us sort it all out. He's pretty good at Perl, knows what he's doing. And he even gave a talk. I don't know who he's mentioning in this talk about software necromancy. Well, so there's a thing called the law of holes. If you're in a hole, stop digging. This is an excavator. The excavator's in a hole. And per the law of holes, it has stopped digging. So in other words, we've got our new tech stack, microservice API backends. One's using Dancer 2, one's using Raisin. And we've got different products. So like we did a timesheet application, we used Dancer 2. Raisin we use for our main core business application. Is it horses for courses? What do you need to solve? New UI with React.js and Node.js. So we said all new development will go through the new stack, which is fine. But all the old maintenance and small changes, that's with the old stack, but only small, nothing big, no new greenfield type stuff. And that way, you don't make the hole any bigger. You start digging a new hole somewhere else. In 20 years' time, that hole will be in a similar state if you're not lucky. So you should be using modern Perl. So I put some resources up on the slide. The modern Perl book by Chromatic, of course, is really your starting point. Perl Maven website has many good examples and tutorials on there on how to do things. And you've got resources at learnperl.org. Now, back in the company office, which we're currently sort of refurbishing, we've got a huge pile of old Perl books we're about to throw out, because I would have mentioned some of those, but those books are from the 2000s, and really, things have moved on, so I can't really recommend any of them anymore. So instead of recommending PPP, the book, I'll recommend looking at Perl Critic. Perl Critic got built in all of those things, and you can use it on your code and advise you where you've made mistakes. Now, with our legacy code base, I'll be honest and tell you that if I dared to run Perl Critic on it, I'd have so many things to fix, we'd never actually get anywhere. I was concentrating more at the level of, let's add use warnings and use strict, and then fix those problems. I'll come back later and worry about the Perl critic ones. Obviously, the new code should be having all these applied from day one to avoid that getting to a similar state. Also then, I mentioned Task Kensho. It's quite nice, got a link to a bunch of approved modules on CPAN, which you should be using. The only slight problem we have with CPAN, if you don't realise it, is that you go in and you search for template and you'll be like, oh, man, look at them all. There's dozens and dozens of templating packages. Which do I use? You'll pick the wrong one. So use Task Kensho and you'll find the right one. But what about this deprecated old stack? So I did a system architecture diagram to visualize the 2B state. Now, it's too small to read here, really, but you get the idea. That's the old stack there on the right. We're keeping it going because customers are still using it. Remember, we've got some smarty asses sort of React.js on the front, reading the HTML and rewriting it on the fly. So this is the new stack on the left. But that stack on the right, how do we get it to work? We want to get rid of Mod Perl 1 and Apache 1 because it's obsolete. It's been obsolete since 2001. So what are we going to do? When I say obsolete, let's have a look at what we were using. So the versions of Red Hat we have used over the years. Originally, when I joined the company, it was Red Hat 7. And I mean 7, not Enterprise Linux 7. And then Red Hat 9. And then later on, Red Hat Enterprise Linux 2, 3, 5, 7. And currently, we're moving on to Rocky Linux 8 because obviously the Red Hat root has been closed off because they're no longer providing that open source service. We don't want to get locked in with them. So 1999, Perl 5005 with the legacy CISM database. That's what we had when we started. So a bunch of code got written with that. 2002, Perl 5.8 came out, and it's pretty problematic with UTF-8. We tried using it, we had lots of problems. We're like, oh, what's going on? Why isn't it working properly? Finally, 5.8.1 came out, and that did work. So that's where a lot of our code got parked. So you get the code working, and you ship it to your customer, and from that point, you're going to stop, basically, because you're running something that's working. So you're not going to do huge amounts of new development, generally speaking. Well, not unless you can persuade the customer to pay you the money to do it. So that's legacy with MySQL 3. 2008, Perl 5.8.8 shipped. And then 2014, Perl 5.16.3. So we were sort of stuck there like a moment in time, like one of those sort of dinosaur things that flies, it's stuck in aspic or whatever it is, the amber. Like the code was stuck in amber, and there you could see it, beautiful, but couldn't really get at it. So back in 2003, I'd rewritten a lot of the early code to run under Mod Perl 1, and we used a wrapper Apache Perl run that loaded it into memory because it was all bad old CGI type code, and rather than spend ages writing it, with Apache registry, we use that as a shortcut because we're always making trade-offs, to save money. You've got to justify your spend. So the Mod Perl porting guidelines are here. I won't spend too long on those, but it's use scripts, use warnings, fix the headers, local variables you should be using how, not my, things like that, and code should be going inside of blocks because otherwise the second time it gets run from the eval string in memory, that initial code doesn't get run again. Then you wonder why your program doesn't work. Get rid of your globals as much as you can and replace procedural code with objects. So we did do a lot of that. But if there's too much, it becomes impractical. So we did what we could, but there were still some bits I just didn't simply have time to get to back in those days. And garbage collection is the other problem, really. So Mod Perl 1's got an end of execution hook, and you've got to release any locks and other resources that you used, because otherwise you could get a deadlock. So how did Apache 1 work? Most of the people in the room probably know, but I'll go over it because some people reading it won't know. You've got a http.conf, and in there you had a script alias keyword, and it's mapped anything with /CGI bin or CGI Perl to a particular directory, and when it saw a file with a CGI extension, it would execute it, and it would run a Perl as a child, and poof, exec to Perl, run the script. So in our case, all these directories, 600 entry points, 600 scripts. How about Mod Perl 1? So this is when the Perl interpreter C code was compiled in with the Apache 1 C code to make a single binary to execute the scripts, and that way you avoid the Perl binary load time overhead. But we already had a lot of CGI scripts, not enough time to use Apache registry, so yeah, as I said, we use Apache Perl run. Basically, what it does, reads them into a string in memory, and it evals it when you want to run it. In order to save on memory, because that's quite memory intensive, we put a system Apache 2 in front, and that was serving all the static assets, and then we could minimize the number of Mod Perl processes in action. But it was pretty fast, and it was solid for 20 years. So we couldn't justify the cost of rewriting it to Mod Perl 2 in 2005, because it was like, it's working, the customers are happy. Shall we rewrite it all to Mod Perl, to Mod Perl 2? Why? And then you go, but it's newer, it's shinier. And then, of course, the management go, but it costs us money. We're not going to do it. So let's talk about obsolescence. I don't mean old programmers, although some of us are pretty old. I did laugh when David gave his talk and he was talking about doing stuff on the Commodore PET. Oh, sorry.
Deprecated is the wrong word, and I'm going to really point out that. It's not deprecated, it's just removed from the core. Discouraged is a good word.
It says CGI-PM is no longer considered good practice.
That's not deprecation, that's discouraged.
Okay, I shall consider myself suitably discouraged.
Don't use it, same thing.
Yeah. So it is discouraged, and getting Apache 1 and ModParl 1 to compile on RHEL 7 was a bit challenging. So I had to change the Apache 1 C code to make it compile, and then lots of extra flags to get the Perl side to compile because it was giving segmentation violations for obscure reasons. Finally managed to get it all working. I would describe that as quite tricky. So the thought of having to do this when we get to Rocky Linux 8 and future versions of the OS, I was like, right, that's it. It's going in the bin. We're going to replace it with Plack. Before bad things happen, sort of bad things that happen are things like security holes or segmentation violations happening in the background that you don't realize, and it has knock-on effects in your data and that sort of thing. So moving on from CGI to Plack, how do you go about that? Now, if you just start from scratch, it's easy peasy, isn't it? You'll follow one of those guides on that resources page. I've done it. It's working. Yeah, not so easy when you've got these 600 odd CGI programs you're trying to run. So with a modern framework, there's a single entry point, and there's like a master server that routes the requests onto the children, and they all then find the correct class method, and they dispatch it for you. But you can fake it in the same way that we faked it with Apache Perl run back in all those years ago. We couldn't bother to rewrite it to use Apache registry. You can use Plack app CGI bin, which is a module that does pretty much the same thing. You get the URL in, it maps it to files on the disk, the CGIs. It's read them all into memory, and then it just evals that string when you make the request. So it has the effect of, making it work for you. I mean, it's not nice, but then nice would be rewriting it all from scratch and taking 3 years and then having code that needs all that QA and debugging and customers getting very angry and leaving you and that sort of thing. So we don't do that. Well, using an SSO then, instead of a web page for login. So what we did was we put on the front end an open source SSO called Glue, which is pretty good. And that people log in through that. And then we use that. It comes with an SSO proxy, which is Nginx, inside a Docker container. And then what you do is we replace the Apache 2 front end for routing to the back end using authorized requests. In the old world, we had cookies, for user session for authentication, but in the new world, it is a bit different. So I'll show you how we've done it. In the Nginx, you've got your file, you've got your virtual host. Firstly, we're passing through some environment variables that will appear in the web request. OIDC claim email. This is the UUID of the user in Glue. And then when you get into the application, you can use those to match it to the user record in the system and auto-log them on, you see. Then we route the script request through. So here's how we do it. If it's a CGI bin or Perl, then I want to go to this server address on port 24001. That's where the backend is that's providing your legacy CGI stuff. The static assets, we're still serving off Apache 2 on the main server, so we reroute those through the same server, but it's at port 80. So then that will get served by Apache 2 as currently. Because one of the principles we've got is minimize the stuff we change. If you've got stuff that's working, don't change it if you don't have to. If you start serving it from something different, it might not work properly, or you'll find out eventually. The other API I mentioned, we've got one that's written using Raisin, which is the core application API. We're also routing that on. So from the React.js front end, it's sending requests, RESTful HTTP requests to this sort of endpoint, and they're coming in as JSON. They're getting response in back as JSON. Sorry.
Question: why say Nginx proxy configuration when you know Apache configurations?
This is the one I got out of that file. Oh, so what do you mean? Good question. You're right. It's Apache, isn't it, inside the Docker? I think what it is we've got an Nginx in front of it before it gets to this stage. That's it. I should have gone back and checked the architecture diagram. So it comes through. This one's on port 17339. So we've managed to get the different services listening at different ports on the same server, and then you can split them all out. And then the single entry point that we're coming into for the legacy HTML page stuff, that's here. So we have a single entry point, which is this Plack loader.psgi. So I'll spend a bit of time saying about how we got this working, because it was a bit fiddly, and it might not be obvious. But on the other hand, you might look at it and think, well, you could have done it better with other modules. It may well be. I mean, in the end, we got it working, and I was just grateful to have it working. But if you've got any improvements, they'll certainly be welcomed. So you can run it as a standalone server like this. Plack up, Plack loader, up it comes. It's running at localhost 5000, and if I browse to that, I've got my web application come straight up. It's very fast as well, much faster than ModPerl in our experience. You can also run it with the debugger Perl-D. It's also possible to debug it using Visual Studio Code. You can set the configurations to pass the file name in as an arg, and that way you can debug it with a nice UI. Now we normally run it from systemd as a service. So there's a systemd unit. So I've got the status, tal psgi, tal service, and it's running. And it's giving you some information. You can see here in bold, that's the actual command it's used to run Plack up, to run it. This is the environment file that goes with it, because we've got lots of different customers. So they've all got separate environments and ports and so on. We're using this to tell it to use Starman as the web server. And then inside the systemd unit, you've got your usual kind of stuff, and then that's the command that runs the Perl program. So inside that script, we're using a number of modules. So we've got Plack's the PSGI toolkit itself, and then Plack app CGI bin as this replacement for wrapping all these CGI scripts without having to rewrite them. Internally, it uses CGI compile. So it reads and caches these Perl scripts in subs, a bit like ModPerl registry did for ModPerl 2, and runs it as a persistent application using CGI emulate PSGI. There's a separate, in the builder, we've got separate things for serving static assets. Now, I've said that we're using Apache 2 as a server static assets, but if you're running it as a developer, you might want to just be able to serve it yourself locally without having to bother with all that Plack builder. So it looks a bit like this. And then we'll get onto this a bit later on. This should run with child exec Perl. Some of the old code is still bad old code, very naughty. So we have to run it in child Perl. So we detect those and we do that. If you needed to do an init hook before things start running, which is possible depending on your legacy framework. On our legacy framework, we didn't need one, but some other people might do if they've got ancient code. You could do it this way. It's a bit nasty, but basically you wrap around an existing function and then you just put your code on top of it. I've done something similar for the cleanup. So in ModPerl 1, it had a register cleanup method you could call, and you could give it a Perl subroutine. It would call it at the end, and you could use an end block as well. So you need something similar, and in here, this is our routine that gets called to tidy up at the end of a run, all the log files and everything. You try and work out what the root directory is of the application and the area. Now, I'll come onto this later on, but you can set it up with environment variables and things like that, which I probably think is the easiest thing out of systemd. But then again, if you've got an existing setup, you might not have that liberty. You might find it a bit more tricky than that. So when we get into the builder, starting off with our icons are going to get served by this static plugin. Not needed in production, but good for development. Then this is the bit where I'm actually getting it to go and route through to do the CGI script serving. So CGI bin / whatever it is, _pe, so CGI. If I see a request coming for that, it's going to get passed on to Plack app CGI bin. That's where the code is. It's going to look for the scripts below that directory, and then the callback to tell it whether or not to fork a child process or run it in the current child process is that. If you wanted to mount a single Perl script, you could do it like that. I just put it in as an example. You never know, some people might just have a handful of scripts they want to do this way. And then everything else I'm doing static serving. I put an example in of how you could proxy the static file serving onto a central server if you really wanted to, but it's not really necessary. So the old headers in the CGI scripts from Perl 5005. Oh dear, time to get the Wellington boots on. So we've got Perl -w, we changed to user bin m for Perl because we're not sure it's going to be under user bin Perl. It might be some /opt Perl that you've compiled locally. Adding in some stuff for the Vim lovers out there. This is the antique SCCS field, %i, %d. When you check this file out from source code control system, it would replace those things without the date and the version number. Eek. Delete that. Use strict, good. $W $W equals 1. This was in Perl 5.5, how you did turn warnings on. So that should become use warnings. You've got your package main. That's because of our legacy framework. There were some modules that expected to be in the global namespace. Not nice, but you know. Are you going to rewrite all these modules? No. Then some rather nasty use lib thing needs fixing. It's relative paths because, well, it's running under Apache. It needs to be relative to that directory, isn't it? Yeah, not in the Plack world, sadly. If you run it through VS Code as well, you'll find you're not in that directory. And finally, this thing, which was like cobbled out of some old kind of CPAN standard header standard. So it's a standard, non-standard header, which needs to be deleted. This is what it looked like afterwards. A little bit of explanation about what's going on. This thing here, I did try using find bin, but it gets a bit confused when $0's got something in like starman space worker, and then it croaks on you. So that wasn't terribly good. And it's difficult because we want to run it under CGI and interactive and mod Perl, and you want to run it under Plack. And you get different variations of things. I tried using things like the __ file and, you know, based on that. But they all seem to come with some gotchas. So we wrote a module to work all this out for you. And then we set the library to our application root CGI directory. And then I've got a single module that does everything. Now, I only found out about this recently, but I'll show you how that works. Basically, it turns on all the strictures, all the features, adds all the library paths, and includes the standard application modules in one line. So this common include header is something I got off a recent blog post from John Napier-Korsky. Wish I'd seen it before. He says, I create a syntax module in the root of my project namespace and use that to set up all the features I want. So here's what I've got in our version. This is John's idea. This will run from Perl 5.6 onwards, amazingly. I was quite surprised. I did try it out on old Perls just to see. So that's our thing that finds the directory. And then the standard use libs to add in our Perl libraries. This subroutine is where you declare what you want to import or set up. And it returns a list. So you see I've got some features and pragmas, UTF-8, strict warnings, feature 5.6, which gives you that nice set of enhancements. I put an example of how you could add on a single feature if you wanted to, like a say, or other ones here, but that needs Perl 5.20, and remember we standardized on 5.16.3, so we don't use those. And then these are our standard application modules, so it loads all of them up. So that, if you imagine you had all that lot at the top of your 600 scripts, now you've just got that one line. And then this is the hook. This is John's bit of code that does the import. So it takes that, requires that, and it uses a bit of magic stuff to make it all happen. Not entirely sure how it all works. This is why you pay experts. So what about those badly behaved scripts I mentioned? I won't go into details about how nasty they are, but you have to fork and run new Perl each time. So currently, originally we had these kind of rewrite rules, and some of the old accounts framework, which is a different framework to our legacy framework, was an even older, nastier framework. So it would fail. So what does it detect them, and then run it under the Apache 2, and it forks off a Perl for you. So it's a bit slower, but it means the code works, and I don't have to rewrite that ancient code. So when we're doing it under Plack, what do we do? This is the thing we saw earlier. We've got this callback we set up, exec_cb, and it will call that with a file name to say, should I run it in Perl in a forked Perl or not? So inside there, I've got something like this. You see, this mirrors what I had in the. I'll go back to it. I can't find them now. I had those Apache rules to say proxy them on to the local Apache 2 for it to be executed. I've just got a similar thing to what that's the equivalent of the Apache proxy rules. And then in that case, I said, yes, you should execute a new Perl for those. But if it's not matched and it ends in CGI or PL, in that case, run it in the current Perl, not a child. So I mentioned about finding the application root, which was a bit problematic. You've got a few options I've listed here. Systemd environment variable, either the Perl5 lib itself, or you can set another one and then make use of it inside your use lib statement. It's a bit like the equivalent of Perl setenv, which you used to use in Apache days. Or you can use this approach relative to the main file app. You could do file-based name, use lib, dir name. I'm sure I've been bitten by this. I couldn't remember exactly what the details were. I'm sure I had problems with that. For our legacy framework, it was using the Apache standard header script file name, so we set that just so it passes through into the framework and it carries on working as it did before without me having to rewrite it all. With CGI mod Perl, you can use find bin, real bin. But as I've mentioned, that will fail under Plack and CGI compile because $0 is not the script path in the child. So what about other changes we might need for CGI compile? First off, get rid of unneeded globals, because otherwise you've got to reset them every run. You're bound to forget one, aren't you? And then you see the sort of thing that happens. First run in, it goes to the CGI, gets the parameter booking number, puts it in booking number, and then uses it. Works fine. Second time you come in, it's already set, so that bar equals means that it won't bother overwriting it, and you've got the old booking number still in a variable. And then you go in, and why am I not seeing my booking? I'm seeing an old booking. Now, it's a simple example, but you get much more complicated code where that then comes and bites you. The other thing needed is to get rid of my lexicals at the top of your package and replace them with our. So this is the stuff that it says in the CGI compile about variable is not available. First time I saw that, I was like, why is it not available? But it's just the way that it's implemented it. They've given a link back to the Apache 1 porting guide, which is full of useful information. I used that quite heavily back in 2003. So here's an example of an old script that was too risky to fully rewrite. The usual cruft, we've discussed it before, haven't we? SCCS, W, oh, no. Then a bit further down the same file, what have we got? Require timesheets display common.pl. See, this written by a C programmer who was used to doing things like hash include display underscore common.c. That's the way it's done. Then I put my Perl code, I put it in the .pl subfile. And then, what's this? It's the main entry point, and you get to the end. There's no braces around it. Now, it runs fine if you run it under a Perl one-off. But if you run it interactively, you're going to be in problems. So after it's been fixed, it looks like this. Something to find the lib root, and then use that lib to find it, and then use tail syntax, all that other stuff gets imported and turned on. Then back down in the main body of the code, I've done lots of this stuff. This is just a simple example. You can imagine there's been a lot of fun and games. This kind of stuff, I moved it into that common module. I took the plunge and rewrote all that code and spent some money doing that. And then I just used the module. And then further down, in rewriting those required .pls, what did I find? Evil global variables. So rather than spend ages rewriting it all, I put them in as an hour block to make them package globals. And then that existing code worked without me having to mess around with it too much. Now you might say, well, just take a hit on rewriting it, Peter. It'll be easy, it'll be simple, it'll be fine. We've heard this before. The trouble is when you've got timesheet processing applications, it's doing lots of complicated stuff. And there's no unit tests, and there's no automated tests. So you're trying to get it to work exactly how it does now, and it's doing all these different things on that timesheet, and you think, what's the chance of you getting it all right? No, yes, indeed. So we don't do that, no. We live with a few package globals and go, ugh, nasty, but that's what you do. Also, I put a brace in. So what happens is this is a string in memory. CGI compile is going to run it, it'll eval it, it'll run. Next time it evals it, it'll still run again. If it was outside of that block, it only gets run the first time. It doesn't get run the second time. So this is a simple case, but the sort of thing you find is there's some initialization code at the top of your script. It got run the first time, your program worked fine. The second time you ran it, that initialization stuff didn't get run. You've still got the old values and all these variables. And now you've got undefined results coming out of your program, which is quite bad.
Sorry, I don't get it.
Oh,
How
sorry.
do you ensure that it's run only once?
So what I'm saying is that if you don't have this and you run it under the wrapper, it's a string in memory and it evals it. The first time it compiles it down, it sees these tokens and it runs them. Then, the second time it evals it, it doesn't run them. because it's inside, it's out of the scope of the block, and what you find is it's only ever run on the first invocation, but not subsequent ones. There's some stuff in the Mod Perl 1 porting guide about this. It's quite nasty.
Yeah. It's nasty.
And by doing this, because it's made a string at the top level, you see, and it's within the scope of the program that's running it. But by doing it this, you're putting it within an anonymous subroutine, so it's being run inside it, and then it gets thrown away when you get to the closing brace. It gets thrown away, so then it gets made anew the second time you come in.
So why is it an anonymous subroutine without a sub iteration?
You don't need a sub. You can just do that, and that's like an anonymous subroutine block,
No.
isn't it?
It's not an anonymous subroutine, it's just a do block.
It's a do block.
It's a block.
A block, yeah.
Actually, internally it's a while which runs only once.
Yeah.
Okay.
But yeah, what I guess the thing is that SM Common and the others set up global variables with values, with like or equals and stuff. And so if the block is not there, they will remain.
That's right.
And if the block is there, then they go out of scope. So the next time, it was run every time, but the variables were already set, so they wouldn't be reset.
Okay.
And we are
So
probably
magic.
it's about the side effect of it.
Yeah. It's. I just think another one of those nasty things.
It is. I can't remember the why it's used. Just don't.
Let's call it magic.
Magic. I think magic's a good word. Okay, so that's it. The link to the slides is on my Programming Staff website. Are there any questions in the room?
I had once a similar project and I tried to create tests automatically. So I was just running under different conditions. It was a kind of a SQL thing. I was storing the tables before and after.
Ah, yeah.
And then I was comparing after changing the code if the changes to the database were the same.
Yes.
So maybe that's an idea. But I don't know, because you said you have no unit tests and nothing.
Oh,
You were refactoring without testing.
we added unit tests at the start of the process where we could and gradually increased them. I'll give you an example with our payroll. So we wrote some unit tests to do exactly what you said, where you set up some data in a Scratch database, run it, capture the output in the pay workings tables, then reset it, and then run it with the new payroll, capture the output, and then there's some automated difference tools you can use to compare the SQL and make sure that it really has got the same values.
Yeah.
And that saved a huge amount of time. 'Cause
Okay,
It was
so-
obvious things like, some fields weren't being set, and you think, I've forgotten to.
Okay, because I understood you in a way that you did refactoring without automatic testing, and this sounds like suicidal.
No, we did add in lots of unit tests, I should stress, before we got to this point of rewriting it onto Plack.
Oh.
The first thing I added basically was a unit test that does this thing where you do the file find recursive to find all the PMs and then check to make sure they compile. And that was number one, and that was like half of the problems gone in one unit test. Then the other thing I did was I added strict use warnings to all the modules, and then I wrote a test that would actually go and run each of them. And just see whether they would, would they run cleanly or detect if there's standard error come out, and then use them to. That was another big list of things that needed fixing. I could probably do a separate talk on those because there's quite a lot to it. And
so you automated that too for your 600 scripts,
Oh, yeah.
generation of the tests.
We wrote a lot of. I also wrote a unit test which is specifically just trying to mock running it under Plack. So basically, it does the Plack test environment and sets the whole mock environment, and then runs the program repeatedly to see if it works under Plack, and that catches you things like the rerun case. And so I wrote that, and then I was using that just to check all the things as I fixed them. Do they still pass? Because I found that there were some old styles of code that would just give an error under Plack that wouldn't under the old approach, for obscure reasons.
Okay, thank you.
A question of, more less of a technical question, more of a people question. Talking about the modernization you went through, how old is your average developer at the company?
How old? Well, they feel older after having worked on this. I can give you a breakdown. So we had some people who were there at the company in the 1980s and 90s,
Okay.
We've still got 2 of them, so about the same age as me. I'm 57. Then we've got some sort of younger people, because the company has sort of gradually gone down just running legacy software. So when I came back, part of it was with some investment to put in a new management team, revitalise the company, redo the products, build up a new development team again, and get it all going, which is what I did. So as part of that, I did a deal with a partner company to provide developers in Romania. And so we have got some people we hired in the UK in our office, and we had people then we hired with the partner company. We've got a mix. It was about 50-50, I reckon. And the average age of them is quite young generally. I mean, probably their oldest guy, he must be about, what, 40 something? Yeah.
Okay.
And quite a few people in their 20s. Whereas the UK side, I had a walk-in who was in his 60s. He was great. He worked with me on the payroll, who'd worked at another company in the UK, but wanted to work close to home.
It's mostly like, you know, where I'm from, will be mostly, you know, companies that work on AS400 compatible systems, etc. They have all those legacy software from the 80s. They keep on doing, just modernizing the environment a bit. So it's a pretty legacy environment you went through to modernize.
Well, there is another tip about that though, in that the new stuff we wrote using Raisin, which is quite nice, it has a declarative style, and you're putting the keywords in, and you're putting rather than writing a Swagger IO spec or an OpenAPI spec file and then using that to mix methods, it's got a declarative style that lets you put the structure of your OpenAPI in the Perl file. So it's self-documenting, and it self-generates the reference information about your API, in fact. So what we did was, these sort of younger guys in Romania, we put them on that. They get the exciting new Perl to work with, lovely shiny new Perl with the modern framework, whereas some of us are older people, we end up looking after the older framework.
Okay, so they became caretakers basically, in many ways. Okay, thank you.
Well, I approve of this talk. Can I just say something to add? Yeah, mod Perl and registry in Apache, the detail is the evil. So CGI is a relatively clean idea, just expensive. Fork and then do that. But the whole CGI module is assumed that the world is thrown away at the end. That's right. And then mod Apache registry comes along, it's the one that runs the CGI, and it takes your script and it literally puts sub randomly generated thing code, and then it puts it at the other end. So it wraps the whole thing and makes a subroutine reference. So you're now subroutines, name subroutines inside name subroutines, so nested lexical variables won't stay shared, because what you thought was a top-level lexical is now a nested one between name subroutines. It won't be shared. That's one of the reasons to go from my variables to our variables. But then if you do that and you have my $foo equals initializer, no, that's okay. They don't get reset to undef. Like my $foo every time will get redone, but our $foo will remember its value from last time. So you take all this working code and you add this hack round there for speed purposes, and then you start having to undo your best practices, because you might have had a lexical at file scope. It's now well encapsulated, and now it becomes a package global variable. And your code that used to work because it had an initializer, it didn't have an initializer, now you have to manually reset your variables at the end, and then eventually you get to what you've done with Plack, and you can go back to writing good code again.
That's right.
That was the kind of what I want to add. It's a hack that you should have just used to get somewhere, and then, well, I think the idea was you used Apache registry properly, but no one did. But I've met code like...
There's always a workaround.
Yeah, I've met code like this, and also the engineering or whatever business thing of, well, we got it in this file, we'll stop now. And then the whole company that was building on coding standard was, we must use our, not my. Dudes, you're writing modules now. We must put it in begin blocks. Dudes, you're writing modules now. You don't understand the timing of this. But I approve of this talk. I should shut up.
Anybody else? Any questions? Or any slides they want to sort of look at again, and any more explanation? The horror. Okay, well, thanks very much. Hope you enjoyed the talk.